this is what we're going to be creating. It's going to be a quote of the day. So it's basically a button. You click on this button and it will randomly generate quotes for you. So if I click on this button now, you can see here, this is the actual quote and this is the author of the quote. All right, so to click a new, you can see also the button color changes. So whenever you want a new, you can hover over it. If you hover, put your mouse in, it changes color. Your mouse out, gives you a different color. So if I click on the new quote button again, I get a different quote each time. So we're going to be using JavaScript, basic HTML, and also basic CSS for the project. I am using a Windows 7 machine. So to create a directory, I'm going to do that on the desktop just by right clicking on any blank space and go new and click on folder. You can do the same if you are using a Mac, and just give your directory any name. I'm going to call mine quote of the day. Feel free to call yours whatever name you like. So that's my directory created. I've called it quote of the day. Next thing I want to do is create the HTML document I want to use. I'm going to be using Sublime Text as my editor. So I've opened up a new file and I'm going to save this file as an HTML document. I'm going to click Save As, and I'll be saving it inside the project directory here. And I'm just going to call this quotes.html. You can see it's also got HTML listed here, so I'm going to click Save. So this file now is going to be an HTML file. I have already pre-staged the code, so I'm just going to copy that in and then explain line by line. It'd be a lot easier and more efficient for me to explain it this way. So this is the HTML for the project. So I'm going to explain the code line by line. Line 1 here is what is referred to as the doc type. So it's the very first thing you have to indicate in an HTML document. The doc type is not part of the actual HTML document, but it is a declaration basically telling the web browsers that the content of this file is going to be HTML5. Line 2 is where the HTML begins and it ends on line 25. So any content between line 2 and line 25 is regarded as the HTML element. So we've got the head section here. You can see this head tag here. That's the opening head tag and that's the closing head tag. And inside the head tag basically is where you have things like style sheet, you have meta tags and so on. So they're just for informational and reference purposes. So here on line 4, I've got a reference, which is a link to an external style sheet I will be using for this project. I have not created a file yet, but when I do, I'm going to call it quotes.css. And this is the reference. This is where it's going to be. It's going to be in the same directory as this HTML file. So this is just a link. You can see rel here. This rel basically is an attribute and tells this anything in green here, they're all attribute. You can see here it tells you also what type it is. It's going to be a text and it's going to be a CSS file. Line 5 is where the heading tag ends. The body begins on line 6 and ends on line 23. Any content inside the body tag is what is going to be visible to the user. So inside the body tag, I've got a div. So a div basically is a division. So you can divide a section of the page. Inside the div is where I want the quote to be rendered. So, okay, so here I've given it a heading. Line 9 is a heading, so it's going to be a heading tag, and it's going to be quote of the day. That's the closing tag, that's the opening tag. Line 10 is just going to be a paragraph that will display some text telling the user to press the button below to receive a random quote. Line 12, I'm defining the button. See, that's the opening, that's the closing tag. And when you define a button, you have to attach an event handler to it. Basically, a button, what you do with the button, you click on it. So this on click event will handle the event of the click. When we click on the button, this on click method here will reference this, will call this method. I've set the on click to equals to this method is going to be a JavaScript method or function that I will be defining later inside my JavaScript file. So when you click on the button, it will call this function, and the code inside that function will respond to the click. And this is just a text that will be displayed on the button that will say new, click on new quote or new quote. And here I've got another div inside the main div. This div here, this mini div on line 13 to 17 is where we are going to render the quote. So we've got a paragraph here with an ID called quote output. What that means that we're going to output the result. So when the user clicks on the button, it will generate a random quote and display the quote inside this paragraph here. On line 16, we've also got the author and ID called output. This again is a paragraph, and the name of the author is going to be displayed in a separate line inside this paragraph. These are comments. This is how you write comments in HTML. So anything that's got a comment on will be ignored when the code actually executes. So this is the closing div for this div. And on line 18, we've got a script. On line 21, I've got a script tag, and you notice you got the sroc attribute. Basically, this is the source, so I am referencing an external JavaScript file. So the actual quotes that will be generated are going to be located inside this JavaScript file. I've not created it yet. When I do, I'm going to call it quotes.js, and it's going to be in the same directory as my HTML and CSS file. So hence I've just done quotes.js because it's going to be in the same directory. So this is basically the HTML for the application. We've got a reference to our external JavaScript, which we'll create later, and also a reference to our external CSS. So that is it for this lecture. I'm just going to click on the file option and click save all. We can quickly run this so we can see what the structure looks like. So to run it, open up your directory, which is this one in my case, and I'm just going to click on this HTML file, and it should give us the current structure of what it looks like. So this is what it looks like at the moment. We haven't got any CSS, but this is the button. So the idea is to click on the button and it will generate a random quote. So yep, if you've got your page looking like this, well done. That means we are on the same page. Inside our HTML, I've already made a reference to the CSS, and I called it quotes.css. So let's go ahead and create that file. So I'll click on the file option, click on new, and I'll save this new file. I'll save it as, I'm going to save it into the same directory as our HTML file. So I'll call this quotes in lowercase quotes.css. So the name must match what I have specified in my HTML. So I'm going to click on this drop down and just select the CSS option here and click save. So I've called it quotes.css. So if we go into the HTML, you can see it matches what I've called it. So again, I have pre-staged the CSS just to save time. It is really basic CSS, so I'm going to add it and then explain the code. So I have added the HTML, so let me run through with you. So on the left, when you're styling, you always have to first indicate the element you're styling. In this case, I'm styling the div here, and you can see we've got divs here inside our HTML. So what I'm saying is that I want any text inside the div, I want the text to be aligned to the center. And here we've got the H1. If we go into our HTML here, we've got an H1, which is the actual title of the app. So here I'm setting the actual size of the text, which is known as font. I'm setting that to 80 pixels. And the font family I'm using is Impact. You can also specify several font families when you are specifying a font, so that if one is not available, it will default to another. And here I'm styling the button, which is this here button here, and the button, I'm giving the width of the button to be 250 pixels, the height to be 80 pixels. I want the background color to be blue, and I want the text inside that to be white. So please feel free to play around with these values to try and customize them to your own taste. Alright, so with every CSS styling, you must have the opening curly braces and the closing curly braces. And don't forget to put this comma, the semicolon at the end of each of the CSS styling. Okay, so once you've given it the property of value, you must end that with a semicolon. So next, I am styling the paragraph. So I want the font, the size of the text inside the paragraph, to be 35 pixels. Okay, so you can see again, I've ended the value of the property with a semicolon. Very important. If you miss out the semicolon, the CSS will not work. Here, the button hover, basically hover means when I put my mouse over the button, I want it to change color, and the color I've given it is green. The default color of the button is blue, but when you put your mouse over it, I want it to change to green. So again, you can give yours a different color. So I'm just going to save this. I'll click save all, and then I'll go into the application and see what it looks like. So I'm going to open up my directory, which is this, and take a look. So I've now got my CSS. So let's run the HTML and see what it looks like. Excellent. So this is what the application looks like at the moment. Obviously nothing, you can see this is the hover I was talking about. If I pull my mouse over it, it changes color. Nothing will happen at the moment because I have not incorporated the JavaScript functionality to give us the random code generation. So we'll do that. So let's create our JavaScript file. We've already made a reference to it inside our script from the HTML file, and I called it quotes.js. So I'm going to click on the file option in Sublime Text and go new, and I'm going to save this new file as a JavaScript file. So I'm going to call it quotes.js, and just select the drop down here and make sure I select the JavaScript file. Alright, so I'll save that. So I now have a JavaScript file. So anything you can see here on the bottom right hand corner, it says JavaScript as well. The first thing I want to do is create an array. An array, I'm going to use the array to hold the values of the quotes. So to define an array, I'm going to first of all create a variable. I'll call var for variable, and I'm going to call it array of quotes. Notice the use of camel case. Camel case basically means the first letter or the first word is lowercase, and then the first letter of other subsequent words are in uppercase. So you can see the O here is upper and the Q in quotes is upper. Alright, so I'm going to set that to equals to an array, and this is how you define an array in square brackets. So in between this array here is where I'm going to place the quotes. So you can select your own favorite quotes. You don't have to use mine. So these are just some of my favorite quotes. So I'm going to just paste that in there inside this array. So these are the quotes that will be randomly generated when you click on the button. So I've enclosed them inside an array. You can see that's the opening array, which is the square bracket, and this is the closing array. So I'll just go through just one of the quotes. I'll go through the first one here. So you can see here I've got the author. Because they are text, we need to enclose text in quotes. So I've got the author here, and after that I've got a colon, and then we have the name of the actual author, and then a comma. Notice I've enclosed everything inside opening curly braces and closing curly braces, and there is a comma, which is important. Whenever you put a comma, that means you've got more to come. So here, this is the first quote here, and this is the second quote. So each in between each curly braces, you have the author, and then you have the name of the author, and then you have the actual quote itself. Notice, it's very important to notice the quotes that have enclosed each of the parts. So the author, you've got quotes, and then a colon, and then you've got the actual author, and you've got quotes around it, and then the comma. It's very important, because if you miss out the comma, it will not work properly. So make sure you place a comma after each of the author's name, and then a comma also at the end of the closing curly braces. The only place where you don't need to place a comma is the final curly braces. So the last quote, you don't need to put a comma on the last curly braces. All the others, you put a comma, but the last. Very important, but you must put a comma after the name of the author. Alright, so we have got, I've only used just a sample here. You can make this as long as you want, add as many quotes as you want, as long as you have it enclosed inside the array. That should be fine. And also make sure that each of the author name has a comma. After the name, put a comma. After the curly braces, put a comma. The only place you don't need a comma is the last author. So this is the last one here, so I don't need a however, if I decided I wanted to add more quotes underneath, I would need to place a comma there and add more quotes. So that is the array. The next thing I want to do is create a function that will randomly select each of the quotes using the length of the array, and we're going to be using the maths.random method. An array length basically refers to the values inside the array, and it begins with a 0 index. So for example, this one here will be refers to as 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. So just underneath the closing array here, I've added a function, and I've called it random selector, and I've passed it this parameter of array length. Array length basically determines or makes reference to the values inside the array. So the very first value is going to be 0. This will be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. That's what the array length is referring to, and it's going to return a value. It's going to return math.floor. Math.floor basically is going to be used to round a number downwards to its nearest integer. Alright, so the math.floor will round the number up to the nearest integer. Math.random will randomly generate random numbers based on the array length. So the next thing I want to do is create a function called generate quote. So if we look inside our HTML here, we already made reference to this function called generate quote. This is going to be, this function here is already attached to the button, which is the onClick method. So when you click on the button, it will call this function. So that's the function I'm going to create now. So I'm just going to add it underneath the random selector function. Alright, so I've added a function called generate quote. So this is a function that will be called upon when you click on the button inside the HTML. So the name is generate quote, and in between the curly braces is the code that will execute. So here I've got a variable called random number, and I've set that to equal to the random selector, which is this function here. And inside the parentheses, I'm passing it the array of quotes. The array of quotes is this variable here I have created, so I'm passing that value as a parameter there, and I've attached the .length. .length basically, it will determine how many quotes there are in the array. So the very first quote will be 0, and the last will be, so it starts from 0 and 1 and so on. Okay, so the length basically refers to the length of the quotes, that is how many quotes you have in the array. That's what that means. And then we're using the document or get element by ID method. So this basically, which is the quote output, this here is inside our HTML, which is this quote output here. That's what it's referring to. So we're getting that ID called quote output, and we are replacing it, the content, with this inner HTML. And you see here, these quotes here, basically we are replacing it with the quotes that will be generated. So they will create a space plus the array of quotes, which is this here, plus the random number. Okay, so each of the quotes will be randomly assigned a number based on the length of the quotes in the array. So the random number will be, so it will, for example, it can randomly select this author here or this quote, and it will then attach the quote plus whatever the quote says. And then here, line 62, again, we're using the document or element by ID. Here we are going to, this is where we're going to output the author. Okay, so if we go into the HTML, we've got this ID here. So basically it will take over this paragraph and inject the author here. That's what that is. So it's going to just replace whatever content you have inside this paragraph or this ID and replace it with the actual quote and the name of the author. So it will grab the quote from the random number assigned to the quote and also attach the name of the author to the quote. So that's basically what this function will do. So this is the function that would do a lot of the heavy lifting for the application. So I'm just going to click on the save option, and then we can test the application. So I'm going to click on the directory here and double click on the quotes.html. When you're running your project, you always have to run the HTML, not the CSS or the JavaScript. They're already linked to the HTML. So double click on the HTML and you should get the application launched. So this is the application now. So if everything works out fine, if there are no errors in my JavaScript, I should be able to click on the button and you can see the quotes generated. You can see, all right, so everything is working as designed. Okay, so as I click, I get a new quote each time. So that is it for this application. Thank you for watching. If you have any problems, please do let me know. Thanks and all the best.